Hello, hello. Check this chat, make sure my audio's good. I just switched over to microphone. Thank you, it's all good. Excellent, we got an awesome presentation today. We got to go deep. As always, have some more guests lined up. I'll be making those announcements later. We got some pretty interesting people coming on. As you saw the preamble, the ad before the show, Archaix Underground, it took off. It's about 96 hours since launch, and we're just under 2,000 right now. Sometime today we'll have 2,000, just under 2,000. I added 5 new spaces yesterday, and I started adding a lot of material to them. It's a lot. And I have the material, and you guys have provided some fantastic stuff for 1902, our 1902 database, and the Errant's personals are taking off. I'm really impressed. I'm really impressed with the participation. I knew it was going to be something pretty profound because nobody else is doing this. And you know what? We got to have our own space. I'm not talking about Errants. I'm just talking about people in general who are just tired of the toxicity. I mean, X. I'm so tired of X, but hell, it's a means of communicating to those who can't hear. So I'm still doing it. I left Facebook years ago. It's just, you know what? Have our own social media, and I'm cool with it. 2 more today, or maybe tomorrow. I'll wait till tomorrow because I still have a lot to upload. But 2 more spaces are going to be added. This will be number 33 and number 34. This is going to be 34 different areas of the platform now that you can participate and do all. You can either review like audio files and video and all that, or you can participate with your errant business and personals and hobbies and all. There's so many activities, but the 2 new ones are going to be sky phenomena. And the idea came to me because I saw people were posting in the ancient mystery section. And some of these modern things that are happening in the sky, like MB333 records, those are really interesting, but they don't really belong in the ancient mysteries section. So we're going to create a whole new section for everybody who wants to report unusual sky phenomena that's going on in their neck of the woods, or what they see online that they find interesting. So we'll have the new one. Also, the other one that I'm going to be adding tomorrow is Astronomicon. Astronomicon is for our astrologers in the community, for them to post all their findings, their services, what they do. It would include things like tarot. You guys know I've had a softening concerning the astrology and the tarot and all that. I mean, it's always been the individual, and not the item in and of itself. It's always the individual soul that's practicing these things, and it really has little to do with what's being practiced with. So I have no problem including it. And other than that, we had a great chat the other day. Yeah, he was on fire, wasn't he? He was on fire. So let's see. Right. I need to open up a document. Let's see. Yeah, he was on fire. Mark Passio's passionate. He gets his point across, and a lot of you responded to it because, man, what's that video at? Like 29,000. It's a lot of people seen it the past 2 days. All right. Let's see. I need to open this up real quick. Make sure you guys can see what I can see. So we're going to be consulting NotDiamond AI. It's a unique AI. It literally, it's an aggregate. It reaches out to the other AI systems and finds out what their information harvesting is, and it comes back with what it believes is the best answer. It's pretty interesting. So we're going to see if it's pre-programmed to go in certain directions. Can it be corrected? Will it admit that it's wrong? This is what we're going to see about AI. I'm only talking about my hat. That's real quick way to get the attention of my moderators, talking about my hat. So let me share my screen, get right off into it. All right. Let's see here, y'all should see this. I don't know if y'all can read. I don't know if you can read that. It's kind of small. I can blow it up a little bit, but it might change. It might change some of the same. Might change some of the stuff. This is NotDiamond. So we are going to ask it some very penetrating questions. And these are things that you can replicate. You can copy my questions and you can ask Grok. You can ask Chat GPT-4, OpenAI, Gemini, whatever your preference is, and see what they say. But I am not asking questions in a way to promote any type of bias, as you will see. You'll be able to ascertain this yourself. No doubt. There's no doubt. So the very first thing I'm going to ask right now is it to keep its, I'm going to say, all right, please keep responses concise, I'm even going to be polite and I'm going to say thank you. All right. Of course. How can I assist you today? I tell you what, here's how you can assist me real quick. I'm going to put in here, name 10 famous historical people who lived in the period of 50 BC to 50 AD who had their lives recorded by writers who lived at the exact same time. Name also these contemporary writers. You can't get simpler than that. There is no bias in this question. No bias in this question right here. Name 10 famous historical people who lived in the period 50 BC to 50 AD who had their lives recorded by writers who lived at the same time. Name also who these contemporary writers are. Okay. Oh, we got a list. Whoa, we got a list. Can you guys see that? Julius Caesar. He lived at this period of time, and his life was recorded by Suetonius. Suetonius lived in the 2nd century AD, but it's based on contemporary accounts. So Julius Caesar also wrote a book that we have today, but I don't like that answer. That's not what I asked AI. I asked AI for contemporary writers. Cleopatra, I believe that would have been Cleopatra the Fourth. Yeah, her life was recorded by Plutarch, and yes, he lived at the same time. Augustus, later called Octavian, his life was recorded by Suetonius and Tacitus. Tacitus was alive in that time period, but Suetonius was not. He was using contemporary accounts. Mark Antony, the lover of Cleopatra, recorded by Plutarch. Cicero, you guys know I like his book on government and on oratory especially. Cicero, recorded by Plutarch. Contemporaries like Brutus and Cassius. Virgil was a Roman poet, epic writer, recorded by contemporaries like Horace and Ovid. Horace, recorded by contemporaries like Virgil and Ovid. They would have not, yeah, Virgil, Horace, and Ovid were all poets. They would all know each other, and they all lived at the same time. Ovid, recorded by contemporaries like Horace and other Roman poets. Herod the Great, recorded by Josephus for his first century, and contemporary accounts. Livy wrote a record of the Roman Empire. Livy, recorded by contemporaries and his own extensive historical work. So who are these contemporaries? We have Plutarch, Suetonius, Tacitus, Josephus, Horace, Ovid, and Virgil. So if we're going to be absolutely honest, there's like 3 of these that don't qualify. So I'm gonna look at this real quick. I got a note over here because I'm trying to see. There's 10 listed here, but there are other. NotDiamond didn't mention Tiberius or Caligula. How could you miss Caligula? And Tiberius was documented also by Tacitus and Suetonius, and Caligula was Suetonius and Philo of Alexandria. That's Philo Judaicus of Alexandria. So another one that's not really mentioned. Okay, that would be Seneca the Younger. I don't know why, but his life is documented by his own writings and Tacitus. So there's a few that he missed. But you know what? I asked him to name 10. So it's not the AI's fault. I specifically asked the AI to name 10. So we have 13 or 14, but that's okay. So the point being made here is that it's not me telling you this. I'm not making this up. It's widely known by historians that the 1st century AD is one of the most well-documented in history, considering all the text and writings and eyewitness accounts and all the things that happened in the world all the way up to the 1500s. It is the most easily verifiable, and it just has the most contemporary records. The 1st century, for some reason, we just have a lot of surviving texts, and we have things like numismatics, statuary, architecture that lends credence to many of the things that were recorded at the time. The 1st century is packed full of verifiable data. Code Red Girl. Thank you. So that's just a little warming up exercise. The AI is not wrong. I limited it to 10, but I shouldn't have done that because I know of other ones that were alive at the time that I just named that I'm Pliny the Younger, Quintilian. There's still more. So that's on me though. That's on me. So I'm going to mention, because my next question is going to be kind of important like that, I would like to go ahead and mention, okay, so we can add Tiberius, Caligula, Seneca the Younger, someone else. to the list. Well, younger to the list. To this list. Because I intend to ask another question. I'm just trying to keep it fair. I'm not trying to pop any surprises on NotDiamond. Sure. So, Tiberius, Caligula, and Seneca the Younger also qualify. They're added to this list. This is 13 historical personages that were written about within. Most of them were written about, like 9 of them were written about in their lifetimes by men who lived during their lifetimes, and it looks like 4 of them were written about. It says contemporary writers, but it doesn't go into specifics. However, within 100 years, somebody had written about them. Now, this leads to my second question. Like I said, we're not popping any surprises on NotDiamond. I want absolutely unfiltered answers. We're going to see if NotDiamond is pre-programmed to push certain narratives. This is where we're going this. So, here's my second question. Out of all the writers that we've listed who recorded the lives of famous people, did any of these same writers mention a Jesus figure who performed miracles, was crucified during an earthquake and eclipse in Jerusalem, and raised from the dead and ascended to heaven in front of 500 witnesses? It's a fair question. It's a really fair question. I'm not attacking anything or anybody or even anyone's belief. It is a very fair question, as I'm going to show you, because extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And if all these ordinary leaders and politicians and poets have all these extensive testimonies and interrelated writings that survive to today, and we know so much about them, then an event such as mentioned in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John cannot have escaped the world without notice. Here's the question. Let's see what NotDiamond has to say. Out of all the writers you mentioned who recorded the lives of famous people, did any of these same writers mention a Jesus figure who performed miracles, was crucified during an earthquake and eclipse in Jerusalem, and raised from the dead and ascended to heaven in front of 500 witnesses? This is the story of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So, NotDiamond responds, no. None of the writers mentioned earlier recorded a Jesus figure performing miracles, being crucified during an earthquake, an eclipse in Jerusalem, raised from the dead, and ascending to heaven in front of 500 witnesses. The earliest extensive mentions of Jesus come from the New Testament and later Christian writers. Among the non-Christian writers of the time, there are also detailed accounts of Jesus' life and ministries. Josephus, a Jewish historian, mentions Jesus briefly in his work, Antiquities of the Jews, but the text has been subject to debate regarding its authenticity and interpolations. This is an amazing answer. One, I didn't ask it for anything other than what I asked. It added the context of telling me where the Jesus story came from. We're going to get to that. We're going to go deep on all that. We're going to go deep on Josephus as well. But it's cool that it still kept it concise, but it answered my question. So what exactly did it answer? Well, it answered that all these writers like Plutarch, Suetonius, Tacitus, Josephus, Horace, Ovid, Virgil, Seneca the Younger, and many others, Livy, Virgil, Cicero, Horace, none of them mentioned anything about these amazing events that were supposed to have happened in Palestine and Jerusalem. That's all we've done in 2 questions, is establish that. One of the most well-documented centuries in world history from a secular historian standpoint has zero correspondence. We have to look into religious writers in order to find anything of value in this story. Now, having said all that, he does mention Josephus. Because he mentioned Josephus, I'm gonna have to educate the AI. However, I might not be educating NotDiamond, because NotDiamond does mention that the Antiquities of the Jews text has been subject to debate regarding its authenticity and interpolations. That's really interesting. So before we go into Josephus, we're going to wait. We're going to wait, because I'm going on a thread. Our third question to NotDiamond is along the same vein. Remember, we're practicing the Sherlock Holmes, the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle type of analysis. Once we remove everything that is absolutely impossible, what remains, however improbable, must be the truth. So this is the process of elimination. Here's the next question. Is it true that these writers also lived in the 1st century AD? Philo Judaeus of Alexandria, Pliny the Elder, Plutarch, Tacitus, Ovid, Cornelius Valerianus, Lucan, Martial, Pompilius Mela, Statius, Chaeremon, Pliny the Younger, Seneca, Cassius Dio, Flavius Josephus. Real simple question. I expect a pretty simple answer. Okay, so some of these writers you mentioned lived in the 1st century. Philo Judaeus of Alexandria absolutely lived in the same years Jesus was supposed to have lived. Ovid lived in the same years Jesus was living. Seneca lived in the same years Jesus was living. Lucan was born 6 years after the crucifixion date, but he was still alive in the 1st century. Pliny the Elder lived during the days of Jesus, but he was very young. But he lived to 79 AD. Remember, Pliny the Elder, he wrote natural history. He died at Vesuvius, when Mount Vesuvius blew up. Pliny the Younger, his son, was born in 61 AD. So yes, he was alive during the 1st century. Now, Tacitus was alive during the 1st century for 44 years. And then also in the 2nd century. Plutarch was alive for 54 years in the 1st century, and then in the 2nd century as well. Flavius Josephus was also alive for 63 years of the 1st century. Flavius Josephus, he was one of the Flavians. Statius was alive in the 1st century. Martial was alive in the 1st century. Pompilius Mela was the late 1st century. Chaeremon was the late 1st century. Cassius Dio was the 2nd century. So he needs to be removed from the list. 2nd century is 155 AD to 235. He's the only one that needs to be removed from the list. Although he did write about the events of the 1st century, he didn't live in the 1st century. That's my perimeter. I'm being very focused on the 1st century. So Cornelius Valerianus is not a known historical figure, and I couldn't find any. Well, very, very interesting, because I pulled his name out of an old book. Wow. Could be misspelled. But that's okay. So all these, Philo Judaicus, Ovid, Seneca, Lucan, Pliny the Elder, Pliny the Younger, Tacitus, Plutarch, Flavius Josephus, Statius, Martial, Pompilius Mela, Chaeremon, And only the last two, Cassius Dio and Cornelius Valerianus, need to be removed from that consideration. So it is worth noting that none of these writers, with the exception of Flavius Josephus, and that's a matter of debate, mention Jesus or the events described in the New Testament, or the events described in the New Testament. So it just answered for me my next question, because my next question was going to be the same as an earlier question, only now I'm including all the authors, not just the ones that wrote about famous people. So now we have a long list of authors from these questions that all lived during the first century. And I'm going to ask, just for a matter of record, even though it gave me a little obiter dictum there, I'm going to go ahead and ask it anyway. Did any of these writers of the first century AD record a Jesus figure who performed miracles, was crucified during an earthquake and eclipse in Jerusalem, and raised from the dead and ascended to heaven in front of 500 witnesses? Now, none of the first century AD writers listed earlier recorded a Jesus figure performing miracles, being crucified during an earthquake and eclipse in Jerusalem, raised from the dead, and ascending to heaven in front of 500 witnesses. The earliest detailed accounts of Jesus' life and ministries come from the New Testament, which was written by Christian authors. Among non-Christian writers of the time, there are no extensive accounts of Jesus' miracles, crucifixion, resurrection, or ascension. Josephus, a Jewish historian, mentions Jesus briefly in his work Antiquities of the Jews, but the text has been subject to debate regarding its authenticity and possible interpolations. Now we can get to Josephus. I needed to clear the air on all that to let you know, from the absolute scholarly, verifiable, historical record, secular historians, there isn't a trace of a story that you find in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We haven't even been in these questions. Haven't even been in these questions 10 minutes. And already this is very well established. All right, so we can move on now. I am kind of interested in Josephus. Josephus does interest me, because the fact that the NotDiamond AI has mentioned Josephus twice now, it felt it was necessary. So now NotDiamond AI is being truthful, saying that the text has been subject to debate regarding its authenticity and possible interpolations. So I'm going to tell you now that the church got caught. This is what NotDiamond's telling you, is talking about. The church got caught forging a single sentence that refers to Jesus in the massive writings of Flavius Josephus in his epic work Antiquities of the Jews, which otherwise completely ignores the entire story of Jesus, the crucifixion, sun darkening, earthquake, everything. Josephus mentions none of these things. So the reason scholars know that the text is a forgery that was added in to the Antiquities of the Jews text is because the writings of Josephus were extensively quoted by both Tertullian and Eusebius in the 3rd and 4th century AD. Let me repeat that. Tertullian and Eusebius, both of them appointed by Rome to go through the historical record and cite every possible citation that a Jesus figure actually lived. These men were agents of Rome appointed to the task of trying to prove that Jesus was historical. A Roman authority had them do this. Their names are Tertullian and Eusebius. These men both cited Flavius Josephus's writings, both of them. And the reason modern scholars believe that the reference to Jesus is an interpolation is because there's no way these men, Tertullian and Eusebius, would have both missed that reference. Therefore, it must have crept into the Josephus text long after Tertullian and Eusebius had wrapped up their research. That's why scholars are saying it's a forgery, because the earliest citations of the text don't mention it. You can't get around that. It's called an interpolation. So, in 1776, many of you know the date, American Independence, Declaration of Independence signed. So, in 1776, Christian Bishop Warburton, you'll have to forgive me. You Brits are going to have to forgive me. Gloucester, Gloucester, I don't know how you say that, but you know where I'm talking about. The Christian bishop of the Church of Gloucester, I can't pronounce that, wrote that the interpolation in Antiquities of the Jews is a definite forgery, and a very stupid one too. That's a direct quote. He said that. It's a forgery and a very stupid one too. That's embarrassing that somebody 240 something years ago had already done all this research. And yet Christians today are still trying to promote that Josephus recorded about Jesus. He did not. He did not. It's terrible. Gloucestershire. Okay, thank you, Tone Deaf. Gloucestershire. Interesting. It's not the only forgery, guys. There are more. Josephus is just the most blatant. There's another one we'll get to in a little while. We'll talk about that later. Let's ask NotDiamond another question. So far, it's been very, very truthful with us, even adding obiter dictum that I'm not asking for, but it's still relative to the text. So I kind of wonder, is it programmed to push the Christian Reich narrative, or is it being very, very honest with me and it's just providing a little addendum to what I'm asking? I asked it to be very specific. I didn't ask it for all this extra data, but it's kind of cool that it's given it. So the next question to NotDiamond AI. Do you agree that if a man walked on water, turned water into wine, raised a dead man back to life, was born of a virgin, was whipped, crucified, and stabbed with a spear, died, came back to life 3 days later, and flew up into the sky before 500 people, that this series of events is more astonishing than anything these first century writers actually recorded? Let's see. Let's see if NotDiamond AI can differentiate between the normal and the astonishing. Let's see. Let's see. NotDiamond responded, yes, such a series of miraculous events would indeed be considered astonishing and extraordinary, likely standing out as remarkable compared to typical historical records from the time. If widely witnessed and documented, it would have been a significant topic of interest for contemporary writers. However, it is important to note that the accounts of these events are primarily found in religious texts, specifically the New Testament, and not in the surviving works of the non-Christian first century writers. These religious accounts are central to Christian belief, but aren't corroborated by the detailed contemporary non-Christian historical records of the time. I am getting more and more impressed with NotDiamond AI. I'm getting more impressed, sticking to the facts. Damn, I'm trying to get this. I'm trying to push the envelope. I don't know if this AI is going to let me. Let's see here. All right. So my next question, could the reason be that the events are not mentioned by the first century writers is because in the first century, these events were merely literary and not historical? You understand here? I'm not claiming the events weren't a thing in the first century. That's not my claim. I'm claiming that the church turned what was a literary masterpiece into something later. They passed it off as history. The reason I'm claiming that is because they had to murder so many people in order to do it. If you don't know the history of the church councils and all the violence that broke out in many of the synods and many of the meetings, you don't know what I'm talking about. But it lasted all the way to the 1200s when they finally exterminated the Waldenses and the Cathars. Yeah. The history of the church is one of murdering everybody who disagreed that Jesus was historical. Yeah. Why do you got to kill people? Why you got to kill people? If Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is conveying actual history, you should be able to verify it easy. The answer is yes, that's a possible explanation. Many scholars consider the possibility that the accounts of Jesus' life and miracles in the New Testament are based on oral traditions, myths, and literary devices, Greek stage play or Samaritan stage play, which would have been the same thing. Yeah, I tripped out on that. There's no difference at that time period because the Samaria at the time was called the Decapolis, and it was the 10 Greek cities in Samaria, which is very interesting because the story in, the Jews didn't accept Jesus. He was very different from them. Yeah, well, he spoke Greek. All the New Testament books were written in Greek. Greek was the lingua franca of the time. So, and he came from a Greek area, Samaria. The Bible doesn't really talk about that, but anybody who's done first century research, historical research on Samaria, you'll find out that it was called the Decapolis, and it's the 10 Greek cities founded in the times of Alexander of Macedon. This is where Jesus came from. All right, so literary devices rather than historical events. So NotDiamond says, the fact that these events are not mentioned by non-Christian writers of the time could suggest that they were not considered historical events by the general public, or were not widely known outside of Christian circles. The New Testament accounts may have been intended to convey spiritual truths, theological themes, or mythical narratives rather than the historical facts, which could explain the lack of corroboration from non-Christian authors. I believe that 100%. I believe that because of what the Nag Hammadi texts say about Jesus. I believe that because of what the church did to everybody who didn't believe Jesus was historical. Why would you murder people because they believe something differently? Unless you were pushing a lie. So let's continue. Let's ask some more questions. I like that answer. So it said it's plausible. It could very well have been a literary device. No doubt. So, next question. Do you agree that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence and that the burden of proof in establishing the Jesus story as history lies on the believer and not on the critic? Yeah, that's where the Christians have got everything backwards. They get frustrated because we don't believe. You got to understand, I come from a Christian environment, Southern Baptist to the core the first 40 years of my life. Yeah, I used to be a Bible thumper. I know my sword. I still know my sword today. But you know what? I left that lifestyle. I grew out of it and I realized the world is much bigger than what the Bible conveys. So, and I understand that God cannot be confined to a book. And Christians get really upset when they talk to people and you don't believe them on what they have to say, and they get upset when you trample on their beliefs, as if their beliefs have substance. Yeah, it's and all along. I mean, if you believe something that is absolutely extraordinary, then the burden of proof is on you to convey it, and not me to believe it at all. So let's see what NotDiamond says about that question. Do you agree that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that the burden of proof in establishing the Jesus story as history lies on the believer and not the critic? So, I see a lot of people talking about ads in the chat. I don't have ads in my chat. Is this something YouTube is doing? Because I don't do that. I don't see, as the admin of the channel, I don't see anything you guys see. I just see Pamela Swan and a couple of the moderators putting links in the chat every once in a while. But if y'all see ads in my chat, I would like you to screenshot them and email them to me. I need to see that. Because I've never activated any settings that do anything like that. If there's lots of ads popping up, I need to see it. Yeah, because I'll put a stop to that. Some people are saying they're not seeing any ads. Other people say they are seeing ads. There's not supposed to be any ads in a live chat. I've never seen that before. But I'm not going to let that interrupt me right now. I would like to see screenshots from people. You can email them to me. All right. So, NotDiamond AI responded with, yes, the principle that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence is often applied in historical and scientific contexts. When a claim involves events that are outside the norm or defy natural laws, such as miracles, it typically requires a higher standard of evidence to be accepted as historical fact. In this case, the burden of proof would indeed lie on the believer or proponent of the claim to provide compelling evidence for its historical validity, rather than on the critic to disprove it. This approach is common in historical scholarship and critical analysis. Well, I'm glad to hear that. Glad to hear that. We can go ahead and leap right to the next question. Did an earthquake and an eclipse happen over Jerusalem in AD 33 as preserved by any first century writer? Okay, I'm not asking about Jesus. I'm not asking about miracles, virgin birth, walking on water, turning water into wine, flying into the sky, being raised from the dead, crucifixion event, miracle worker. I'm not asking about any of that. I'm asking something that it can be verified very easily. Did an earthquake and an eclipse happened over Jerusalem in AD 33? I should have said at Pentecost, because the crucifixion was at Pentecost. You know what? I'm going to go ahead and write that inner writer as happening at Pentecost. Should have already had that on there. Okay, so NotDiamond says no. There is no record from any first century writer of an earthquake and eclipse happening over Jerusalem in AD 33, specifically during the crucifixion of Jesus or at Pentecost. While there are accounts of earthquakes and eclipses in ancient literature, none of them match this specific event. The biblical account of the crucifixion, found in the New Testament, Matthew gives all the verses, Matthew, Mark, Luke, describes a darkness lasting 3 hours. It's a Phoenix event. Remember, I told you guys. I've got a video. This is how Jesus stole the Phoenix. Remember, it's a Phoenix event that was imported into the Christian narrative, but they stole the records from Trallas, who wrote about the Phoenix darkening over Bithynia in 31 BC. They turned it to 33 AD. This was later copied by the Book of Mormon, but they dated it 34 AD, but it's the exact same event. It was stolen from the records of Tralles. So anyway, the first century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus does not mention an earthquake or eclipse during this period in Antiquities of the Jews. Flavius Josephus and Philo Judaicus, neither one of them mention. Two Jews, neither one of them mention any of these events in Jerusalem. And that is just, that's super compelling. So let's go into, let's ask it another question. How about how many early Christian documents, gospels, and writings have been dismissed by academia as spurious, as forgeries, or fabrications long after the events they depict? Let's see what NotDiamond has to say that. I'm going to read it again. How many early Christian documents, gospels, and writings have been dismissed by academia as spurious or forgeries long after the events they depict? Wow, look at this. Look at this answer. NotDiamond responds, many early Christian documents, gospels, and writings have been considered spurious, forgeries, or written long after the events they depict by academic scholars. These include the Gospel of Thomas, a non-canonical gospel composed of sayings attributed to Jesus, likely written in the 2nd century. The Gospel of Peter. Fragments of this gospel describe events surrounding the crucifixion and resurrection, likely written in the 2nd century. The Gospel of Mary, a Gnostic text presenting teachings from Mary Magdalene, likely from the 2nd century. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas describes the childhood of Jesus, also from the 2nd century. The Acts of Paul and Thecla, an apocryphal text about the Apostle Paul and a woman named Thecla, written in the late 2nd century. The Epistle of Barnabas, an early Christian writing sometimes considered part of the Apostolic Fathers, likely from the late 1st or early 2nd century, but not considered apostolic in origin. The Apocalypse of Peter describes visions of heaven and hell and was considered for canon inclusion, likely estimated to be from the early 2nd century. You have to understand, none of these documents exist from the 2nd century. These documents do not exist. What NotDiamond is telling you is the official versions that these writings later appeared in the records of Christianity, and that it is Christian academics that date them to likely around the 2nd century. But the actual compositions themselves have not survived. We don't have copies of those writings. It is estimated that these writings all date to the 2nd century. That's a problem. That's a problem. That's 100 to 160 years after the crucifixion event. It's like writing an authoritative version of the Civil War in 2015, 150 years after the Civil War is over. And not one single book or article has ever been published since 1865 about the Civil War from which I could have got all my data from. That's a problem. So, anyway, excuse me. It is interesting that NotDiamond would mention the Barnabas deal. It is interesting that the NotDiamond would mention Barnabas. We'll look into Barnabas here in a little while. I'm pretty I have some notes on the Nag Hammadi text that will go into the Barnabas deal a little bit more. But yeah, that's not Diamond's shoe. Not Diamond's hitting it. Absolutely. So, next question. Could it be possible that the reason Christianity produced so many forged and spurious writings is because the story of a Jesus figure who performed miracles was crucified during an earthquake and eclipse in Jerusalem and raised from the dead and ascended to heaven in front of 500 people was merely literary from the beginning? Could it be possible that all the forged texts aren't really forged texts at all? They're just evidence that the whole story was a literary masterpiece. And when it comes to versions of stories and books, you got all kinds of different versions out there, even of modern stories. I mean, even Star Wars wasn't written originally by George Lucas. He bought the stories from somebody else and then rewrote them. Let's see. Not Diamond responds, yes, that's a plausible explanation. The fact that Christianity produced a large number of forged and spurious writings could suggest that the story of Jesus was not rooted in historical fact, but rather a literary or mythical narrative from the beginning. In this scenario, the story of Jesus would have been created to convey spiritual truths, theological themes, cultural values, rather than to record historical events. This would have allowed early Christian writers to create and embellish stories, characters, and events without being constrained by historical accuracy. The lack of contemporary non-Christian sources to corroborate the miraculous events described in the New Testament, combined with the numerous forged and spurious writings that emerged in the early Christian period, could be seen as evidence that the story of Jesus was not based on historical fact, but rather was a product of literary and mythological creativity. And I can add to that also murdering everybody who believed otherwise is also pretty stringent, cogent evidence that the whole story was a fiction. Just had to add that. So, next question. We're moving right along. Is it true that the earliest writings of the church fathers were very defensive, and this defensiveness in their writings gave rise to the term apologetics? We should ask Wes Huff that question. Hey, Wes, what you think about this? Is it true that the earliest writings of the church fathers were very defensive, and this defensiveness in their writings gave rise to the term apologetics? Yes, that's true. I love Not Diamond. Man, yes, that's true. The earliest writings of the church fathers, such as Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and Origen, were indeed defensive in nature. Why would you be defensive? Why? You're promoting the fact that a guy just proved to you that you're an immortal too. And he did all these things. And there's all these witnesses and all these people and lit a fire. And these disciples went out and did all these things. And they didn't care about being tortured and put in pots of oil and all. And man, you should have your spirit on fire to be telling the truth. You shouldn't be sitting in a castle writing and sending letters all over the place and getting discouraged because people write you back and say, man, you're a lunatic. What are you talking about? And none of this ever happened. And then you have to forge more letters and you have to send a document called the letter of Pontius Pilate and Tiberius Caesar, and you got to send this out, and then these forgeries go out, and then other people back up your forgeries because they're hired by the church to put the forgeries out, and then everybody thinks you're crazy, so you're so defensive, and you start putting all these treatises out, and they're so toxically defensive that you get scholars like Plotinus and Porphyry now openly writing books at that time period and attacking you for being a shill. Like, what are you talking about? None of this happened. None of this happened. That's what Plotinus and Porphyry did. They went to war against all these early church fathers, talking about, you guys are liars, you guys are shills, none of this happened, it's all BS. So Justin Martyr, Origen, Jerome, Irenaeus, they're all very, very, very defensive. This has been known by scholarship for a very long time. It's very unusual for a movement to begin so highly defensive. They were responding to the criticisms and the attacks from the non-Christian philosophers, pagans, and Jews who questioned the validity and rationality of the Christian beliefs. The term apologetics comes from the Greek word apologia, which means a defense, a justification. The church fathers wrote apologetic works to defend Christianity against various criticisms, such as accusations of being a superstitious cult, a threat to Roman authority, or a corruption of Jewish scripture. Today, there's a whole seminaries, which are nothing but turning out a whole new species of devil, all about bringing mammon to the church. Seminaries have special courses on apologetics, just how to defend against all the people who are actually smarter than you and know more than you do. It's crazy. These early apologists sought to demonstrate the reasonableness of the legitimacy of the Christian faith, often by appealing to scripture, philosophical arguments, and the testimony of eyewitnesses. The defensiveness of their writings was a response to the challenges and criticisms they faced, and it laid the groundwork for the development of Christian apologetics as a distinct theological discipline. Shouldn't even have. If you're saying something that is true, you shouldn't have to build a school of thought with centuries and centuries of people adding to it. That's embarrassing. It's embarrassing that your faith requires a special school of academic thought that has had over 1,000, over 15 centuries of scholars adding to the defenses and arguments, and still one simple conversation can dissect Christianity to its core. It's embarrassing. It's embarrassing. Let's go to the next question. Is it true that the Apostle Paul, nor any other New Testament writer after the four Gospels ever mentioned the sun darkening and earthquake at Jesus' crucifixion? Can you imagine that? What are you talking about? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have the story of the gospel of Jesus, but it seems like after Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the story disappears, because you don't ever hear anything else in the New Testament that talks about these wonderful miracles of Jesus, all these things that he did, all quoting Jesus, saying all these things. That, man, it's crazy. It's crazy, guys. Is it true that the Apostle Paul, nor any other New Testament writer after the four Gospels ever mentioned the sun darkening and earthquake at Jesus' crucifixion? You would have never stopped me from talking about it. Yeah, it'd have been the main thing I would say. Hold on, man. You guys know, you know, you heard it. I know you heard it from Pliny the Elder and the Greek naturalist, man, how the sun went dark for 3 hours. There was an earthquake, man. They had crucified this guy. And, man, 3 days later, man, he wasn't even in the tomb. The tomb rolled away, man. There's about over 500 credible witnesses that saw him float up into the sky. Yeah, you wouldn't have been able to shut me up. How would you not include that in the rest of the New Testament record? So, oh wow, NotDiamond says, yes, that's true. I asked it, is it true that the Apostle Paul nor any other New Testament writer after the four Gospels ever mentioned the sun darkening or the earthquake at Jesus' crucifixion? It says, yes, that's true. The Apostle Paul in his letters does not mention the sun darkening or the earthquake that occurred during Jesus' crucifixion, as described in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. because that's where it's described in the four synodic gospels. It's in those three gospels where the story's told. In fact, none of the New Testament writers after the four gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John mention these events. Paul's writings focus on the theological significance of Jesus' death and resurrection, but he does not include details about the natural phenomena that occurred during the crucifixion. The silence of Paul and the other New Testament writers on this matter has led some scholars to suggest that these events might have been added to the gospel narratives at a later stage. Remember what I told you from my research? The church stole the Phoenix account from 31 BC about Bithynia in the sun darkening episode caused by the Phoenix phenomenon. It's also where they got the forgery that was later called the testimony of Dionysius the Areopagite, where he talks about how the whole people had to bring their candles and torches and lanterns out in the middle of the day because the sun darkened, and that Dionysius the Areopagite looked up into the sky. It's in the testimony of Pontius Pilate. They looked up into the sky and it said that the whole order of the heavens was changing. No one ever said any of these things. These were invented hundreds of years later. They are church forgeries, and it's widely known. So anyway, yeah, that's awesome. That's amazing that NotDiamond would say that. Let's continue with some more questions because that's amazing. So that leads to my next question. Is it true that the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were composed over a century after 33 AD? Okay, I want to offer a little context here. The world was a very different place in 1973. In the month of May of 1973, I wasn't even alive. But I know from my studies, I know how much the world has changed, and I've observed it since 1973. I'm 52 years old now. I'm 52. You would have to add 48 more years to get 100. I can't imagine how much the world has changed. I guess I can. I can imagine it, how much the world has changed since 1925. So I'm going to ask this question. Is it true that the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were composed over a century after 33 AD? Otto, you said you're 6? You were 6 years old? Uh-oh, we have our first disagreement. We have our first disagreement. Oh, I see what it's doing. I already see what it's doing. Okay. NotDiamond is now pushing the narrative. NotDiamond responded, no, that's not entirely accurate. While the exact dates of composition are debated among scholars, most scholars agree that the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written within the 1st century AD, likely between 68 and 120 AD. Now, the majority of scholars date the Gospels as follows: Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. All of them, according to this, composed in the late 1st century to the 2nd century AD. Now, except for Mark is 1st century. All this is good. But now, NotDiamond is pushing a narrative because not one manuscript exists from the 1st century of any gospel narratives at all. NotDiamond has already admitted that there is zero evidence from the historical record that any of these things happened. Now, it's relying on Christian academic evidence for the dating of the Gospels. But we're going to smash that with one simple question. I kind of anticipated, because I see a lot of AIs trying to push narrative. I'm going to ask a question to NotDiamond about the oldest biblical manuscripts. So now it does quantify, and I can't ignore the quantification here. Because in deriving these scholarly dates, this is what it says. These dates are based off various factors, including theological development and language, archaeological evidence and historical context, the absence of clear references to events after 70 AD, the destruction of Jerusalem, the presence of early Christian traditions and eyewitness testimony. So while there may be some variation to the exact dates, most scholars agree that the Gospels were written within a few decades of the events they describe, not over a century later. I don't know what scholars he's referring to, but the ones that I have read and shared with my community all show that none of the Gospels existed before 145 AD. And they provide all their sources. One of them is Waite, published over 100 years ago, and the title of the book is The First 200 Years of the Christian Religion. And the book is fantastic, but it doesn't even matter. We're gonna continue on, and we're going to dismantle that little piece right there. Let me find my little old question here, because there was a because we're going to take that all the way. NotDiamond gave me a mission. Now we're going to totally dismantle all this narrative right here. So, question: is it true that Christianity's oldest surviving manuscript is a small fragment referred to as P52 that is said to be the Gospel of John, chapter 18, and it only preserves 5 verses dated to 140 to 150 AD? That's 2nd century. That's 120 years after the crucifixion. Is that true? Let's see. Uh-oh. The narrative is already disassembling. Is it true that Christianity's oldest surviving manuscript is a small fragment referred to as P52 that is said to be the Gospel of John, chapter 18, preserving only 5 verses? We're talking about a little scrap. 5 verses, and it's dated 140 to 150 AD. NotDiamond responded, yes, that's true. The oldest surviving Christian manuscript is indeed P52, a fragment of papyrus that contains a portion of the Gospel of John, specifically 1831 through 33 and 1837 through 38. The manuscript is dated to around 140, 150 AD, making it one of the earliest known examples of the Christian text. There you have it. That one question just undermined the narrative that was put out here. This narrative is based off speculation. It's wish fulfillment. It's not based off data. The reason we know it's not based off data is because it totally ignores what I'm going to show you throughout this video. I've got some truth bombs to show you about the Nag Hammadi text, about the Apostle Paul, about a whole bunch of things that completely undermine this whole dating. This is the Christian academic dating of the Gospels right here. And the reason they're forced to use these dates is because in the story, the ages of the men, the 12 disciples who were with Jesus, well, they had to have written these compositions at this time in order for the story to be viable. But that's a problem too, because many people think that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were disciples of Jesus. Yeah, I got some stuff to show you. Now, so right there with one question, we have already taken a major chip out of the narrative of the dating of the Gospels. The oldest fragment is just a small piece, and it dates from 140 to 150 AD. I don't know if the AI even understands it just contradicted itself, but it doesn't even matter to me. because I'm not relying on this. Well, we're going to go even further. P52 is a small fragment measuring about 3.5 inches to 2.5 inches, and it contains only a few verses of text. Despite its small size, it is significant because it provides evidence of the existence of the Gospel of John at a relatively early date. Relatively early. That's mid-second century. That's mid-second century AD. It's worth noting that while P52 is the oldest surviving Christian manuscript, it is not the oldest known Christian text. Other texts, such as the writings of the early Christian fathers, Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, are known to have existed earlier, but they have not survived in their original manuscript form. I am so glad that NotDiamond mentioned Clement of Rome and Ignatius of Antioch, because I'm about to drop some more truth bombs on you about these agents of Rome. Next question. C. Copy. We're going to go a little further. Is it true that we've already talked, we already mentioned P52 is the oldest. So is it true that the two oldest surviving fragments of collections of Christian records, P52 and P46, date to 150 years after the crucifixion date? I want to see what NotDiamond says. Wow. Wow. Yes, that's true. 150 years is a long time, guys. Yes, that's true. The two oldest surviving fragments of Christian records, P52 and P46, date to around 150 years after the traditionally accepted date of the crucifixion, 33 AD. P52, as mentioned earlier, is a fragment of the Gospel of John and is dated to around 140, 150 AD. P46, on the other hand, is a collection of Pauline epistles, letters, that includes Romans, Hebrews, parts of 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Ephesians, Galatians, and Philippians. It is dated to around 175 to 225. That's 3rd century AD. But some scholars date it as early as 150 AD. Of course they would. They're trying to push that envelope. These manuscripts demonstrate a significant gap between the events they describe and the written records that have survived. This has led some scholars to question the accuracy and reliability of the texts, as well as the possibility of oral traditions and textual evolution over time. Well, we're going to go deep on these texts, these Pauline letters. The second oldest writings in the Christian world are the Pauline letters of Romans, Hebrews, Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Ephesians, Galatians, Philippians. That's crazy. That's crazy. So we're gonna have to get into that. So concerning all those in P46, we're going to ask it something. We're staying very detail specific. Is it true that the two oldest surviving fragments and collections of Christian records, P52 and P46, do not contain references to the earthquake, sun darkening, and the dead raising out of their graves at crucifixion? There it is. Again, NotDiamond responded, yes, that's true. The two oldest surviving fragments and collections of Christian records do not contain references to the earthquake, the sun darkening, and the dead raising out of their graves at crucifixion, as described in Matthew 27. P52, as mentioned earlier, contains a fragment of the Gospel of John. P46, on the other hand, contains a collection of Pauline epistles, which do not mention the earthquake, sun darkening, or the dead raising out of their graves at crucifixion. These omissions have led some scholars to suggest that these events might have been added to the gospel narratives at a later stage, or that they were not considered important for the early Christian message. Well, I'm going to prove to you that all the elements of the Jesus story were added way after these dates. NotDiamond just tried to push a narrative of basically the Christian right narrative of when the Gospels were written, but the actual manuscripts we have are 150 years later. But even what they contain is very telling. So we're going to start. Since NotDiamond mentions that among the oldest Christian records, which are 150 years after the crucifixion, among the oldest Christian records are the writings of Paul. So we need to know what the writings of Paul are conveying to us, because we still haven't seen any evidence of Matthew, Mark, and Luke where the gospel story is told. The Gospel of John is very different. It's considered the Gnostic gospel. Now, it's all about the Logos. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke is where this great collection of stories are about this miraculous, Jesus. Check this out. Question number 1. This is where we start going deep. Is it true? No, I'm sorry. Hold on. We just asked that question. Just asked that question. Something didn't transfer. Question number 1. Did the Apostle Paul mention Jesus' virgin birth, the three magi, Star of Bethlehem, or John the Baptist? That's a real simple question. It's a real simple question. Since the letters of Paul are the oldest Christian documents in the New Testament, we need to know, what did Paul actually write? No. NotDiamond says no. The Apostle Paul did not mention Jesus' virgin birth, the three magi, the Star of Bethlehem, or John the Baptist in his writings. Paul's letters focus on theology. You already told us about theological significance. I get it. The silence on these matters has led some scholars to suggest that Paul may not have been aware of these traditions. What? Or that they were not considered important for the early Christian message. What? That's gaslighting. You recognize when you're being gaslit. So NotDiamond is kind of pushing the narrative, but we're going to take apart that narrative with the next question. Next question. Did the Apostle Paul mention any miracles Jesus performed? That's just a straight up question. There's like 40 different miracles Jesus performed. That's a lot of miracles in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and a few of them in John. NotDiamond says no. The Apostle Paul does not mention any specific miracles performed by Jesus in his writings. Paul focuses on Jesus' death and resurrection as the central events of the Christian faith. To Paul, it was all theology. Christ and him crucified. There wasn't anything historical about it. That's my point here. The oldest Christian writings, it's a theology. There's nothing historical about it at all. Next question. Don't take my word for it. Take NotDiamond's word. Jesus' method of teaching, the most important, was parables. So we need to know, did the Apostle Paul mention any of Jesus' parables? Why would you ignore a parable? It's a beautiful teaching instrument. But NotDiamond tells us the truth. No, the Apostle Paul does not mention any of Jesus' parables in his writings. Paul's letters focus on theological significance. There's that narrative again. No parables. Okay. So, integral to the story are the 12 apostles. So we need to know, did the Apostle Paul name the 12 apostles? NotDiamond says no. The Apostle Paul does not name the 12 apostles in his writings. In fact, Paul only mentions a few of the apostles by name, including Peter, Cephas, and John in Galatians 2:9. And also mentions James, the brother of John, in Galatians 1:19. How interesting. How could Paul never mention Judas? How could he never mention all the apostles? They're integral to many of the stories. How interesting. So, out of all of Paul's writings, not just the ones found in P46, but out of all of Paul's writings, 13 books in the New Testament, did the Apostle Paul mention the dead raised from their graves at the crucifixion, the earthquake, and the sun darkening? I have not restricted it to P46 because I know some people who are going to be very critical of my video are going to say, "Oh, Jason got one over." No, I'm not restricting it. Right here, did the Apostle Paul mention the dead raised from their graves at the crucifixion, the earthquake, and the sun darkening? Now, Paul's writings are 13 books in the New Testament. Let's see if he ever mentioned these things ever. NotDiamond says no. The Apostle Paul does not mention the dead raised from their graves at the crucifixion, the earthquake, or the sun darkening in his writings. These events are mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew, but not in Paul's letters. Yeah. Well, we've already seen from the archaeological and textual record that the writings of Paul antedate Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, so I'm going to listen. Paul wrote 13 books of the New Testament. They're separated from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John by the book of Acts. Funny thing here, Paul in all 13 books never once mentions the book of Acts. And it's all Paul's acts. It's everything Paul did, according to someone who recorded it. Now, it is interesting, but it's not proof of anything. But we need to ask another penetrating question, because Paul, his writings were allowed. He composed 13 books of the New Testament. So we need to know, did the Apostle Paul ever directly quote Jesus? Is there anything Jesus said that he quoted? We need to know. We need to know. There's 13 books. Some of them are small, some of them are huge. Okay. NotDiamond says no. The Apostle Paul never directly quotes Jesus in his writings, except for one possible instance in 1 Corinthians 11:23 through 25, where he quotes Jesus' words at the Last Supper, and also possibly 1 Corinthians 7:10 through 11 and 1 Corinthians 9:14. However, in these cases, it is not clear if Paul is quoting Jesus' exact words or summarizing his teachings. That's pretty damning. It's pretty damning for two reasons. The evidence, out of 13 books in the New Testament, there's only one book that Paul wrote where there could be quotes, but they're not direct quotes. They could be paraphrasing. However, it's only one book out of 13, and it's 3 different times in the same book. By that rule alone, academia has gone through all the books of the Old Testament and found hundreds of interpolations, because they're normally in groups of 2 or 3, and they're only tucked in one book. Yeah, like thus spaketh Moses, or thus commandeth Yahweh to Moses, or is this not in the law of Moses? That's found over and over and over and over, and it's evidence to scholarship that, yeah, this book, this how are you going to be an authoritative version of what was going on in the days of Moses' life, and how are you going to be one of the books of Moses when you're writing about yourself in third person? Yeah, as in the days of Moses. Wait a minute, I thought Moses was writing this. So anyway, interpolations are often found in this way, because it's like somebody at the end of First Corinthians decided to throw 3 things in there to make it look like Paul kind of knew something about the New Testament. Scholars find these all the time. They're called interpolations. But in this case, even the interpolations are bad because they're not direct quotes. I asked for quotes. So, next question is a very important question. Did the Apostle Paul ever claim to have read an account of Jesus' life? Did the Apostle Paul ever claim to have read an account of Jesus' life? The answer is no. The Apostle Paul never mentions reading an account of Jesus' life in his writings. He claims to have received his knowledge of Jesus through visions and revelations, and through his association with other early Christians. But he does not mention reading any written accounts of Jesus' life. Well, hell, as far as we know, Paul's like Minnie Vanilli, just making up stuff, and there's nothing you can say about it because there's no way you can say they're lying at all. Yeah, man, it's crazy. Now, that question is important because of the next question. If Paul didn't read about Jesus's life or anything like that, then we need to know this question. Did the Apostle Paul live during the time Jesus lived? Did the Apostle Paul live during the time Jesus lived? What? NotDiamond's telling the truth? No. The Apostle Paul did not live during the time of Jesus' public ministry. According to his own testimony, Paul was a persecutor of the early Christian church. And it was not until he had a vision of the risen Jesus on the road to Damascus that he became a follower of Jesus. This event is believed to have occurred several years after Jesus' death and resurrection. Paul, who composed 13 books of the New Testament, wasn't even alive during the days of Jesus. Never read anything that told him anything about Jesus. Therefore, there probably wasn't anything in existence in writing about Jesus at the time that Paul was doing his persecutions. How do we know? Because he persecuted the church, and he would have, in storming with Roman soldiers, he would have acquired a massive library of epistles and writings from people who saw, or if they existed, but they didn't exist. He never read anything. He got his information from a vision. The story just falls apart under scrutiny. So here's an interesting question. Did the Apostle Paul ever meet one of the original 12 apostles of Jesus? I wouldn't be surprised if in the narrative he did. According to NotDiamond, he says yes. The Apostle Paul met Peter, also known as Cephas, and James, the brother of Jesus, on multiple occasions. Okay, I can buy that. Doesn't mean the gospel narrative that we have today is true, because even during these meetings, there is still absolutely no historical or textual evidence that the story of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John of Jesus being a miracle worker, walking on water, crucified, flying into the sky, coming back to life after 3 days, even still does not exist. It's nowhere. So let us ask another question. Did the Apostle Paul ever mention a single person Jesus healed or resurrected? NotDiamond says no. The Apostle Paul does not mention any specific person Jesus healed or resurrected. How could the story of Zacchaeus not been known to Paul? Healing the blind, the dumb, casting demons into the pigs. How did you not know Jesus walked on water? How did you not know? "13 books of the New Testament. It doesn't seem like Paul knew a historical Jesus. So, did the Apostle Paul ever mention Judas' betrayal or death? That's it. That's one of the signal characteristics of the entire Christian narrative: the betrayal. No, the Apostle Paul does not mention Judas' betrayal or death in his writings. Okay, that's interesting. So here's one. Did the Apostle Paul ever mention the earliest church fathers and writers, Justin Martyr, Clement, Ignatius, Polycarp? Surely Paul would have known about these men. Uh-oh. No. The Apostle Paul does not mention any of these early church fathers like Justin Martyr, Clement, Ignatius, and Polycarp. Wow. Excuse me. Get that out of me. Wow. That's something else. So the last question about Paul, did the Apostle Paul ever mention Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John? These are the four gospel writers. We have a problem here, guys. NotDiamond AI tells us that no, the Apostle Paul does not mention Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John by name in his writings. These are the four gospels by which the entire Christian religion is based off of. And the author of 13 books of the New Testament doesn't know any of these things. He doesn't know anything about the star appearing in the sky, the three magi. He doesn't know anything about a virgin birth. He knows nothing about Jesus being a genius at 12 years old to go to the temple and instruct the Pharisees. He doesn't know anything about John the Baptist basically validating Jesus. He doesn't know anything about the 3.5-year ministry of Jesus and all the healings and all the speeches, and never quotes a single thing Jesus ever said, never mentions a miracle. Doesn't know anybody Jesus knows but two people, and it's questionable. It's questionable. Peter. It doesn't make sense. How has the Christian world foisted this massive deception? Oh, we're not done. We're not done at all. I just wanted to hammer in the point that the oldest Christian documents in existence do not support the Christian academic dating of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It doesn't support them. They're not that old. They only assume to be written in 70, 80, 90 AD because that's when all the disciples would have been very old. But the actual textual, traditional, archaeological, even numismatics, nothing. Nothing in the first century gives any credibility at all to the entire story of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Nothing. So let's see here. We're not done. Apostle Paul questions are deep. They are deep, but we're not done. The miracles are a really interesting subject matter. Excuse me. Oh, I'm wearing one of my. I'll show it off when I quit sharing my screen. I'm wearing one of my t-shirts. All right. So let's get away from Paul and let's ask something else. Is it true that there isn't a single description of Jesus anywhere in the New Testament, and that this is evidence for the Jesus story being literary and not historical? Yeah. Color of his skin, color of his eyes, color of his hair, his height, his ethnicity. Nothing. Nothing. Nothing I found. Let's see what NotDiamond says. The entire New Testament. So, while it's true that there is no detailed physical description of Jesus in the New Testament, this alone is not conclusive evidence that the Jesus story is literary and not historical. However, it is true that the New Testament authors do not provide a physical description of Jesus. Okay, I'll buy that. I will let NotDiamond censure me. I still made my point. I'll take that hit because I'm about to fight back here in just a second. So here's a let's see. This is real. I'm real curious to see what this is going to be because this is a deep one here. Great events in Mediterranean history were commemorated on coins. Numismatics is a powerful tool in establishing the veracity of an event. Coins from every century depict famous rulers, wars, battles, comets, deaths, disasters, alliances. Gods and coins provide excellent dating of events. Is it true that not one coin from the entire world from the first century commemorates any of the extraordinary events of Jesus in the New Testament? See what NotDiamond has to say about that. Uh-oh. NotDiamond says, yes, that's correct. Despite the practice of commemorating significant events and figures on coins, there is no coin from the first century that mentions or depicts Jesus or any of the events associated with him in the New Testament. You know what? I need to do something because I see that there's a loop there's a hole here. I need to plug it. Because I know that there's people who will be critical of this video. There are people still trying to hang on. So let's plug this hole. Roughly how many coins have been discovered from the first century AD Mediterranean cultures? Now in possession of collectors and dealers. Oh no, collectors. Hold on, collectors, dealers, and museums. I've got several hardback books on numismatics. I just want you guys to see coins are everywhere in the world at that time. There are estimated to be tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of coins from the first century AD Mediterranean cultures in the possession of collectors, dealers, and museums worldwide. The exact number is difficult to pinpoint. I get that 100%. But you now understand, we're not talking about this slipping through the cracks. Numismatics is one of the litmus tests on historical veracity. There's nothing. These amazing, remember, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. There is nothing across the board in numismatics that verifies anything in the Jesus story at all. That's it. So, here's a little curious question. Christians hold the Bible as the Word of God, as infallible, but is it not a contradiction? The two different accounts of Judas' death, as recorded in Matthew 27 and the book of Acts, chapter 1, two different versions and two different books of how Judas died. Let's see what if it's going to gaslight us with a Christian interpretation. Yes, the two accounts of Judas' death in Matthew 27 and Acts 1:18 are different. And this has been noted as a contradiction by many scholars. Well, there you go. So the Word of God is fallible. Another question for NotDiamond. Pope Leo X, a figure who is supposed to be a leader in the Christian world, is quoted as saying, "What profit has not this fable of Christ brought us?" Now, would this be more evidence that the Jesus story was literary and not historical, and that the papacy knows it? Does the Vatican know the truth? Oh, we have a very interesting comment here. NotDiamond says the quote is often attributed to Pope Leo X, but its authenticity is disputed. Even if true, it would not necessarily prove that the papacy knows the Jesus story is literary and not historical, but rather that a single pope may have held a cynical view of the church's use of the Jesus story for power and gain. If it's not a true quote, then it goes back to the 1800s, because I got the quote out of a book called Popery, it's called Popery, Foe of the Church. It's from the 1800s. But anyway, I'm gonna go ahead and accept that as a discard. Okay, cool. Maybe the Pope didn't say it. Okay, now we're gonna get into some really peculiar stuff here. Oh, we're far from done, guys. Probably got another 45 minutes in me right here. Nag Hammadi texts are found in 1945, but date to about 340 AD. That's the 4th century, according to the Coptic receipts that are found inside the codices. How do the stories of Jesus differ from the 4 Gospels? How do the stories of Jesus in the Nag Hammadi codices differ from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? NotDiamond says the Nag Hammadi texts, which include Gnostic writings, often differ from the 4 Gospels in several ways. The nature of Jesus. They emphasize a more spiritual or mystical Jesus and often downplay his physical incarnation, because Jesus was a story. That's why. This is why the church eliminated the Gnostics. The Gnostics knew the truth. Salvation. Focus on personal spiritual knowledge, gnosis as a path to salvation, rather than faith in the death and resurrection of Jesus. What is the death and resurrection? It is nothing but the old human sacrifice solar mythos. That's all it is. Teachings include dialogues and teachings not found in the canonical Gospels, often with a more esoteric or symbolic interpretation. The Gnosis was first. The Gnostics were the first Christians. Cosmology. present a complex cosmological system with multiple divine beings and emanations, archons. These differences highlight the diverse early Christian beliefs and interpretations of Jesus' message. Put it together here. I just asked, this is verifiable archaeological history, 1945, a collection of Egyptian Christian Coptic texts were found. When they were interpreted and when they were looked at, there was Coptic date sigils on the inside of the codices that told archaeologists this whole collection dates to about 340 AD. 340 AD is over 200 years after the Christians are claiming Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written. And yet these haven't been touched by anyone. They've been buried since the first century. Oh, excuse me, since the third century, 340 AD. They've been buried. They've been uncontaminated. And yet here are original Christian documents that do not give us a historical Jesus. They give us an esoteric one. This is why the Roman Church, which was carnalizing Christ, had to eliminate the Gnostics. They had the accurate records. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are compositions of the Church of Rome. And we'll get to that. So that's a good answer. That's a good answer. Here's the next question. Oh, this is a good one. This is a humdinger. Here's my first humdinger for this video. Do the Nag Hammadi versions of Jesus support the gospel story of a man who walked on water, turned water into wine, raised a dead man back to life, was born of a virgin, was whipped, crucified, and stabbed with a spear, died during an eclipse, came back to life 3 days later, and flew up into the sky before 500 people? Does the Gnostic Nag Hammadi library support the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John version of the gospel? Uh-oh. NotDiamond AI says no. The Nag Hammadi texts do not support the specific narrative of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection as described in the canonical gospels. They often omit or reinterpret these events, focusing instead on spiritual and mystical themes. Do you see the gaslighting here? They often omit or reinterpret these events. This is evidence that AI is still invested with a modicum of trying to push a narrative, Christianity. They often omit or reinterpret how is the Nag Hammadi texts, which are originals that have been buried for 17 centuries, how are they omitting anything? They're original texts. How are they reinterpreting anything? There's no evidence Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John existed for them to have had copies of them to reinterpret. They're giving the original text, which is all non-historical. It's theological. It's esoteric. You got to watch out for that gaslighting. They're real good at it. Real good at it. Next question. Does the discovery of the Nag Hammadi text having different versions of Jesus than the four Gospels support the idea that the Jesus story was originally literary and only after a period of time conveyed as historical? Let's see what NotDiamond has to say. That's my take. That's what I believe 100%, but I don't know what NotDiamond's going to say. NotDiamond says yes. The Nag Hammadi texts suggest that the early Christian traditions were more diverse and literary in nature, and that the canonical gospel accounts may have been a later development presented as historical. Holy shit. Can't make this stuff up. Can't make it up. So we're going to move on to something beyond the Nag Hammadi text. No sense. There's a whole bunch of, there's 50 something writings in there. We don't need to talk about them all. We got enough. But there's another text that's not a part of the Nag Hammadi library. We need to ask NotDiamond about the Epistle of Barnabas, because the Epistle of Barnabas is really interesting. It is the very first Christian record that actually mentions miracles. Does the Epistle of Barnabas date to the 2nd century AD? And does it support the gospel version of Jesus as a man who walked on water, turned water into wine, raised a dead man back to life, was born of a virgin, was whipped, crucified, and stabbed with a spear, died during an earthquake and eclipse, came back to life 3 days later, and flew up into the sky before 500 people? We are asking AI if the Epistle of Barnabas verifies the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John narrative. The Epistle of Barnabas is dated to around 100 to 130 AD. In my own notes, I have 150, but it's okay. The Epistle of Barnabas is dated to around 100 to 130 AD, making it one of the earliest Christian writings outside the New Testament. However, it does not mention many of the events described in the gospel accounts, such as Jesus' miracles, virgin birth, and resurrection appearances. Instead, it presents Jesus as a spiritual figure, focusing on his sacrifice and symbolism rather than historical events. You know what? I misspoke a minute ago. It does not mention the miracles of Jesus. I misspoke. It's the exact opposite. So anyway, I have it as 150 in my notes, but I'll accept that. 100 to 130 AD. And no, the Epistle of Barnabas is a totally different version of Jesus than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The Epistle of Barnabas is closer to the versions of Jesus in the Nag Hammadi texts. Man, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John taking shots. They're taking hits here. It's hits. Taking a bunch of hits. Excuse me. All right. So, some other things I want to bring to your attention. I want to bring some things to your attention. Those are my questions for NotDiamond AI. But NotDiamond AI had mentioned several things that I want to address. I need to address these things. Let's see. Y'all, I was going to not share my screen, but you know what? I may as well share it. Keep sharing it and show you what I got. So, I need to see if y'all see what I'm seeing. Let me wait a minute and see if y'all can see what I'm... Okay, cool. You do see it. So, some of the things that NotDiamond just mentioned, we need to talk about. So, the Apostolic Fathers, Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, Polycarp of Smyrna. Guys, not one of these men, who are the very earliest Christian Apostolic Fathers, they're called the Apostolic Fathers. Not one of these men was alive during Jesus's alleged ministry. And these are supposed to be the greatest authorities of the church. They were closest to the events, but none of them were alive. They lived in Rome, Antioch, and Asia Minor. They didn't even live in Palestine. They didn't even live in Jerusalem. They all died between 99 and 155 AD, meaning the very earliest writer, Clement, wrote his material about 50 years after the alleged crucifixion, if that. That's giving it to him. But if he did, no one still knew it, because Paul never mentioned any of these men. Paul didn't even know who the Apostolic Fathers were. How could you not know? You were persecuting the church. You would have been all in it. Your intelligence apparatus would have been all. You'd have known where everybody was. because you were torturing. You even admitted to it. You tortured Christians. You got information from them before you converted. At least this is his story. So you would have known about Clement and Ignatius and Polycarp and many others, but Paul never mentions them, never quotes them, just like he never mentions nor quotes anything in the Jesus narrative. That's pretty damning. Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, and Polycarp of Smyrna are apostolic fathers, and yet none of them are known by Paul, and none of them even lived anywhere near the events that they're writing about. They weren't even alive when Jesus was here. Clement of Rome, a man who knew Paul and lived in the 1st century CE, makes no mention of Christ's miracles or the resurrection in his writings. He was a prolific writer. Paul never mentioned Clement, but Clement mentioned Paul. Kind of shows you a chain of custody of documents here. So Clement of Rome makes no mention of Christ's miracles or the resurrection in his own writings. And yet Clement is a prolific writer. But he was in Rome, and he is the first apostolic father. How are you the first father of the church and you don't even write about a resurrection? You don't even write about Christ's miracles. So these are the apostolic fathers. They are followed by the church fathers. The very earliest Christian church father is Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr is the first official church father, and he said this about Jesus. He said, "Our Lord's miracles are preserved by tradition alone." Then he went on to write that, "But those of Apollonius of Tyana are most numerous and actually manifested in present facts." So the earliest church father, Christian church father, actually cast doubt that any miracles were performed by Jesus, while asserting that miracles had indeed been performed by Apollonius. That's pretty damning when that's your very first official church father. So who is Apollonius of Tyana? Well, in the year 303 AD, the proconsul of Diocletian emperor wrote the text Philolethes, wherein he exposed the gospel of Jesus story to actually be modeled after the life of Apollonius of Tyana. So we don't just have the attacks of Porphyry and Plotinus attacking all the early Christian writers and calling them plagiarists and liars. We also have the proconsul of Diocletian right here, whose name was Philolethes, and he literally wrote a book in 303 AD explaining that the story of Jesus is a forgery and the actual truth of the miracle worker is it concerns Apollonius of Tyana. For those of you who don't know, the name Paul is the same as Apollo, the Greek. Apollonius is it's Latinizing a Greek name, Paul. The oldest reference to Jesus performing miracles is in the Epistle of Barnabas. Might be the Gospel of Barnabas. I'm not really sure. Still, it's 2nd century AD. 130 is 2nd century AD. 130 is like almost 100 years after the crucifixion. So I have this note here. Irenaeus of Gaul, also one of the early church fathers, fervently insisted that Jesus was 50 years old and had not been crucified, claiming this emerging belief was heresy. What? One of the earliest church fathers, Irenaeus, is literally telling you Jesus didn't die when he was 33 years old. He was in his 50s. And to claim that he was crucified is heresy. What? Can't make this stuff up. So the earliest church fathers did not know Paul or his epistles. That's pretty damning there as well. But we need to get through all the Paul stuff. I've already gone through Paul stuff. I know Paul does not mention the book of Acts. Who was Paul? Why didn't he know all these things? He composed 13 books of the New Testament. Who is he? Now, the scholar Mangasarian writes, this is a quote, "There is not a single saying of Jesus in the Gospels which is quoted by Paul in any of his epistles. And this is unassailable and certainly fatal to the historicity of the gospel of Jesus." So it is an absolute archaeological fact. I don't care about seminary theory. I don't care about all this, Christian academia. No one can get around this fact. There is not one single Christian manuscript that has survived from the 1st century AD. None. The reason they haven't survived is because they didn't exist. The entire thing is an ex post facto composition. Matthew and John's Gospels are very different in perspective. The Gospels of Mark and Luke were written by guys who weren't even participants. Did you know that? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are supposed to be the 4 witnesses. They're supposed to be the 4 witnesses of this beautiful story of Jesus. And 2 of those men aren't even disciples of Jesus. They weren't even there. Did you know that? Weren't even there. It's crazy. Mark and Luke are not among the 12 disciples. They weren't even there. What are they doing writing Gospels? The four Gospels, it's a common belief. You're trained to believe that the 4 Gospels, they're called the 4 witnesses. These are the 4 testimonies. Yeah, it's crazy. It's so crazy. And when you and then it's so crazy reading when academia actually admits. Yeah, man. You know what? I'm gonna let NotDiamond tell you. I don't need to tell you. Let's say, okay, which two of the Gospels were composed by actual apostles of Jesus? Let's see, the 2 Gospels traditionally attributed to actual apostles of Jesus are the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of John. However, modern scholarship often questions these attributions and suggests that the texts were likely written by followers of these apostles rather than the apostles themselves. Thank you. I didn't even anticipate that answer, but that right there just told me that all 4 Gospels are written ex post facto. They have nothing to do with people who were actually walking with a historical Jesus. Thank you. I didn't even know that. Didn't even suspect that was going to be an answer. So glad to hear that. Wow. So for those of you who don't know, there have been a lot of Christian forgeries. Why so many texts that academia has now found out to be spurious? The letter of Pontius Pilate to Tiberius Sirius is even declared fake by seminaries, by Christian academia. They know it's a fake document. The Gospel of Pilate, the Acts of Pilate, also called the Gospel of Nicodemus, it's all fake. The Epistle of Jesus to Abgar, the correspondence of Paul and Seneca, the Apocalypse of Peter, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, the Gospel of Thomas, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, the Acts of Andrew. These aren't the only ones, guys. Christianity began with completely made up and forged text. These forgeries were passed off by the early Christians as true in the 3rd and 4th century AD. Listen, they have a long-standing tradition The early church even passed off the donation of Constantine. There was a guy named Nicholas of Cusa who was the first one to discover this, and he analyzed the donation of Constantine and realized that it was a church forgery because it was supposed to have been a donation by Constantine on his deathbed in 330 something AD. In and the actual original document cited Latin Vulgate Bible verses, and the Latin Vulgate translation had not even come out yet. So Nicholas of Cusa published widely that the donation of Constantine, where Constantine, the emperor of Rome, gave all of Europe and the Mediterranean and all the Roman holdings to the Church of Rome. It's so dumb, but they got away with it. They got away with it. We already talked about Josephus and how Christian scholars know that it was a forgery. And they know it's a forgery because Tertullian and Eusebius both studied Josephus, and they were appointed by Rome to try and prove that there was a historical Jesus. And they studied Josephus, and they never once mentioned the Jesus interpolation that was later in the Josephus text, because it wasn't in the Josephus text when these men were quoting Josephus 1,000, 16 centuries ago. So now we get to Tacitus. Tacitus is another one that you need to know about because Christians will cite. Oh, Jason, you don't understand. Tacitus talked about Tacitus is proof that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is right, and it's not. It's not. Tacitus is not proof of anything. Apologists today defending Christianity will point out that the writings of Tacitus almost 2,000 years ago mention the Christus and equate this to proof of Christianity. But scholarship has conclusively shown that many historic writers defending Christianity also cited Tacitus on other issues, and not one of them ever mentioned this passage. In fact, the Christus passage appeared only in the copies of Tacitus annals in the 14th century AD. Everyone who cited Tacitus prior to the 1500s never mentioned the Christus passage, and they wouldn't have omitted it because they were all trying to prove Christianity was true. It's another reason why academia absolutely dismisses Josephus and dismisses Tacitus. These are easily provable interpolations. Now, Eusebius was one of the church historians that was charged by Rome to try to prove that Jesus was historical. But we need to look into Eusebius, because Eusebius, a renowned church father, he wrote this text. The title of this text is How It May Be Lawful and Fitting to Use Falsehood as Medicine and for the Benefit of Those Who Want to Be Deceived. Man, that's a Christian Riker right there from the beginning. So the official authority on the historicity of Jesus for the Church of Rome was Eusebius, who literally said it's okay to lie for those people who want to believe the lie. Scholars have found numerous blatant lies, misquotes, and anachronisms in Eusebius' writings defending his position that Jesus was a historical person, even inventing works and authors that did not exist. This dude was a freestyler. Augustine of Hippo, another early church father, an agent of Rome, he wrote, "That which is known as the Christian religion existed among the ancients and never did not exist from the beginning of the human race." Now we get to Origen. A lot of people want to cite Origen. Jason, Origen has some awesome writings, man. And let me tell you, the church got on Origen's ass because he believed in the spiritual interpretation of the gospel story, not the historical version. Origen became a student of Ammonius Saccas, a Greek philosopher and founder of the Alexandrian Neoplatonic school of the 3rd century, who taught that Christianity and paganism differ in no essential points. Origen made this switch in his life after he did all his work for the Church of Rome. After a lifelong appointment as a church, as an agent of Rome in writing the church histories, he switches over and becomes a student of I can't pronounce it. Ammonius Saccas, a Greek philosopher and founder of the Alexandria Neoplatonic school of the 3rd century. I believe this is the same school that killed Hypatia, the mathematician, the female, because it was Christians that held her down and then scraped her flesh off with oyster shells. Anyway, Origen switched. Now, he remained a Christian, but his version of Christianity was very different, and the church couldn't accept it. Emperor Justinian I had Origen's writings burned in the year 453, and in the Second Council of Constantinople in the year 553 AD, Origen's teachings were condemned as they undermined the new position of the church of asserting that the gospel story was actual history. Are you listening to me? It's already 553 AD in the Eastern Orthodox Greek Church. The Eastern Orthodox Roman Greek Church is already now in position to finally assert that the story of Jesus is historical. It took them that long. But in order to do that, they had to condemn many things prior to that, like the Gnosis. So Origen's extensive use of allegorical interpretation of the scriptures was controversial. Some church leaders felt that his speculative approach undermined the literal and historical understanding of the Bible. So I don't know why all these people keep quoting Origen. The church themselves demonized the man. So when it comes to the apologists, the early church fathers, Irenaeus, Jerome, Tertullian, Justin, Augustine, Ignatius, they're all very heavily defensive, as we mentioned earlier. And the scholar D.M. Murdoch, who went by the name Archaix, wrote, they were compelled to create forged text and long rebuttals to dispute the various imputations against them. It was during the lives of these men that two scholars, Porphyry and Plotinus, accused the Christians of completely inventing books that did not exist. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, we know that the story of Jesus, some of it comes from Apollonius of Tyana, the miracle worker. And that the confusion of Paul, Apollonius was thrown in there as well. But there really is an origin to the Jesus and Judas narrative. There's an actual historical event. In the year 167 BC, during the Maccabean revolt, a Zadokite named Jason was gaining popularity with the people, and the Jews began to persecute him. He was accused of introducing foreign elements into Judaism. He was a Hellenic Jew, a Greek Jew. That's why he went by the name Jason. That wasn't his real name. So Josephus wrote that his name was actually Joshua, which is Yoshua, which is the same name as Jesus, because Jesus isn't even Hebrew. Jesus is Yahshua, the same name as Joshua, the exact same name. But the leader of the opposition against Jesus, who is called Yahshua, Joshua, and Jason, it's all the same individual. The leader of the opposition, who was on the side of the Pharisees, his name is Judas. The whole story is in the Maccabean revolt, in the books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which is dated 167 BC. I'm not making this up. This is in the Jewish record called the Apocrypha. The story is in the Maccabean books of the Apocrypha, and scholar Archaix, D.M. Murdoch, believes that this true history was overlaid on the life of Apollonius of Tyana, the miracle worker, and the two stories combined gave rise to the Christian story of Jesus 2 centuries later that gave rise to the Gospels. And when we take this into consideration, now we understand why, as I opened up this video, there is zero evidence in text, in tradition, and in archaeology, in numismatics, in anything of the story of Jesus as given to us in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the 1st century, as I documented and showed you, which is one of the best, well, historically documented centuries of all time until the 1500s, the 1st century AD. That's why, because it's a soup made of all the best ingredients. But it wasn't even formulated till well into the 2nd century. It was about 150 AD before somebody started putting all this Jesus narrative together. And then it took 400 more years to actually assert that it was historical. That's the story of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So Augustine of Hippo, one of the most prolific and popular of the patristic writers of the church, completely admitted. He said, I should not believe in the truth of the Gospels unless the authority of the Catholic Church forced me to do so. Yeah, this is Augustine of Hippo, a prolific church writer, an agent of Rome, who literally said, I should not believe in the truth of the Gospels unless the authority of the Catholic Church forced me to do so. That man right there would take the vax. Yeah, man. Jesus' physical description. Church Father Augustine of Hippo wrote that by his time in 430 AD, there was no authentic portrait of Christ, absolutely no knowledge of his appearance. This is the year 430 AD. 400 years, no murals, no paintings, no statuary that showed anything what Jesus looked like. Go figure. Go figure. There's that shirt. One of my shirts, guys. I got a whole bunch of them. I'm gonna wear a new shirt. I'm gonna wear a new shirt every day. Every video I do, I'm wearing a new shirt. I got a whole bunch of them stacked over there that were just delivered to me by Big John. Anyway, guys, Christians are good people. I came from that environment. My dog is going off on somebody, but I came from that environment. There are many Christians listening to me now. Christians are very good spiritual people, but you don't need the institution of human sacrifice imposed on a solar mythos for you to secure any type of eternal advantage. It is a logical fallacy to assume that a loving God would want you to fear him. Now, the demon out of the burning bush in the Old Testament is the one that wanted you to fear him. A loving oversoul is never going to create a place of eternal torment. That's an invention of men, an invention of the church. So my only message here is that we can be spiritual beings by the very activities that we do to other spiritual beings here in the construct. Yeah, we're all spirits and we're wearing avatars. But what we do for each other basically exemplifies our spirituality. And believing that somebody was stabbed in the side after hung on a cross, after whipped, and you know what? Believing in this whole brutal deal, that's the predator versus prey ecosphere of AIX. Artificial Intelligence X has many different versions of history that you can buy into. And if you want to buy into that version, then you have to buy everything that comes with that. And I'm not willing to do that. The historical record is very clear. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is a fiction. It was all literary. And it took over 500 years for the church to kill everybody off and burn every manuscript that said otherwise. That's my presentation, guys. And I'm going to go ahead and hit you guys again because I know I'm within 1 or 2 hours of getting 2,000 members in Archaix Underground. And I'm only trying to convey to people who don't understand because I've been getting emails from other content creators and other people with communities, and I'm trying. Some reason it kind of got put out there that this was only for those who call themselves errants. An errant in Archaix, we only call ourselves errants because we willingly go another way. When the collective has decided something is true and they're going that direction, errants are going to think clearly, and we're going to process everything, and we're going to go our own way. That's all errant means. We are an errant to a very specific domineering system. That domineering system, it controls everything. An errant is someone who is not going to engage willingly in dungeon programming. I got a whole bunch of videos that explain dungeon programming and how you escape those feedback loops. Christianity is one of those feedback loops. I hope this presentation helped you guys. I'm going to be spending the rest of the night in Archaix Underground, uploading a whole lot more content, and it's an open invitation to. I mean, even my critics, because my research is being uploaded daily in Archaix Underground. So those of you who would like to poke holes in my theories and all that, that's where you come to get it all. Free downloads, all videos, audio files, hundreds of PDF books, everything's downloadable. That's where you go, because I don't fear any type of scrutiny whatsoever, because it's going to do is sharpen my sword, and it's going to allow me to better my presentations to those who are willing to receive them. Love you guys. I'll see you in the underground within the hour. Just find me a good. I know what exit I'll do. I know exactly what exit I'm going to do, because it's going down. Love you guys. Welcome to the new social media for the freethinker, the platform for those who do not identify with the collective. Archaix Underground. Explore the 30+ galleries and spaces and interact with kindred souls all over the world, some in your own community. Meet others in Errant's Chat Underground. See or report what's happening in your part of the world. Find others that are close to you. See services and advertise your own in Errant's Personals. Chat with others and share paranormal experiences. Review the massive posts on deep and revealing movies and music that drop real secrets about our world, and look at the health and wellness posts for tips and helps on the human body. You will find hilarious and thought-provoking stuff in meme warfare. Look over and even contribute to the 2026 Isometric Analysis Project, and check out the tips and post-reset pantry and survival tips. Some of you will want to join the Archaix Sentinels as we take deep dives into other content creators' paywalls and search for evidence of integrity or grifters lifting others' content. Explore the audio files of Archaix videos and watch the library of Archaix videos that are not on YouTube. Look over and download the fascinating old books of the Underground Vault Library, or dive in and read the hundreds of articles, posts, and transcripts composed in my decades of research. Review the detailed Archaix charts separated by topics easily followed, and read and contribute to the massive library of powerful quotes. You can read and post your own findings on the years 1901, 1902, and 1903 as we build the database, or look over the post in Flat Plane Examine on toroidal mechanics and simulation theory models of the world. Laugh and even contribute to lifestyles of the grifting and infamous, and post your questions that you want me to answer in live videos on YouTube. Get help with all things Archaix in the admin chat, and look over and post your own arts and crafts and talents. Look over the immense data on the Great Pyramid and Chief Cornerstone research, and review book recommendations about other errants, and even post your own. Check out out-of-place artifacts and mysterious history for intriguing facts about our history and world. And in Immortal Methods, see the techniques, affirmations, and practices that have worked for others in their manifestations of their wants. New spaces will be added, one being on the facts of Christianity very soon. Join us in this explosive community of souls, all sharing this experience.